Welcome back to the Black Feminist Social Work Educational Series. I'm Vanessa Talley, licensed clinical social worker, scholar, and founder of Black Feminist Social Work. In our first presentation, I introduced Black Feminist Social Work as a framework and praxis that centers Black feminist thought and Black women's lived experiences as essential sources of knowledge for social work. Today, I want to take us one step deeper. Rather than simply asking what Black feminist social work is, we're going to explore why I believe this framework is needed. And in order to do that, we have to talk about knowledge. Who produces it? Who gets recognized for producing it? Whose knowledge becomes foundational? And how does all of that ultimately shape the profession of social work? I want to begin with a reflection. So think back to your own social work education. Who were the theorists you were taught to know? Think about the names you encountered repeatedly in textbooks, lectures, assignments, and exams. Now ask yourself another question. How many of those theorists were Black women? I'm not asking this question to suggest that the scholars we learned from did not make important contributions. Many of them certainly did. I'm asking us to notice something that we may not always stop to consider, and that's that the people we are taught to recognize as theorists help shape what we come to understand as legitimate social work knowledge. So before we go any further, just hold on to that observation. Like every profession, social work has developed its own knowledge tradition. That knowledge influences what we believe explains human behavior and social problems. It shapes what students learn, what researchers investigate, and ultimately how practitioners understand and respond to the people and communities they serve. But knowledge doesn't simply become foundational on its own. Someone decides what enters a textbook. Someone determines which theories become part of a curriculum. Researchers make decisions about which questions are important enough to investigate. And journals make decisions about which scholarship gets published. Over time, some bodies of knowledge become deeply embedded in a profession, while others remain less visible. Black feminist social work asks us to examine that process critically and to consider whose knowledge has been recognized, taught, cited, and legitimized. Consider some of the theories and perspectives many of us encounter during our social work education. Theories such as systems theory, psychodynamic theory, attachment theory, ecological perspectives, cognitive behavioral theory, trauma theory, and the strengths perspective. Each has contributed something important to how social workers understand people, environments, relationships, behavior, and intervention. Black feminist social work is not suggesting that we discard these contributions. Instead, I'm asking another question, and that is whose experiences inform the development of the theories we consider foundational, and whose experiences may not have been fully represented. Because a theory can be useful and still be incomplete. And recognizing that incompleteness gives us an opportunity to expand our knowledge rather than reject what came before. This distinction is especially important. Black women were never absent from knowledge production. Black women theorized, they organized, taught, healed, resisted oppression, conducted research, and led movements. They built institutions and sustained communities. And Black women developed knowledge through scholarship, professional practice, community leadership, activism, family, and community traditions, as well as lived experience. So when we talk about gaps in social work knowledge, I don't want us to confuse institutional recognition with intellectual contribution. The issue is not that Black women lacked knowledge. The question is whether their knowledge has consistently been recognized as foundational to the disciplines and institutions in which knowledge is produced. That distinction is central to Black feminist social work. Social work and other helping professions have produced substantial research about Black women. We study disparities in health outcomes, trauma, poverty, discrimination, resilience, and that research can be extremely important and helpful. But Black feminist social work asks us to make another intellectual shift. What happens when Black women are not understood primarily as populations to be studied, clients receiving services, or research participants providing data? What happens when we also recognize Black women as theorists, researchers, community intellectuals, leaders, practitioners, and creators of solutions? This changes the relationship between social work and the communities from whom we seek knowledge. Black feminist social work asks us to move beyond simply studying Black women toward learning from Black women. This brings us to an important question. What counts as knowledge? Academic scholarship is one form of knowledge, and rigorous research remains essential. But Black feminist intellectual traditions challenge us to recognize that knowledge can also develop through lived experience, communities, bodies, histories, relationships, and generations. This does not mean that every individual experience automatically becomes a universal truth. Rather, lived experience can reveal questions, patterns, meanings, and realities that dominant ways of knowing may overlook. Black feminist social work therefore values dialogue among multiple forms of knowledge, whether that is scholarly knowledge, community knowledge, historical knowledge, embodied knowledge, or intergenerational knowledge, and also lived experiences. Those things all matter. The question becomes not which one replaces the others, but what we might understand when we allow them to inform one another. Intersectionality helps us deepen this analysis. Kimberly Crenshaw gave us language for understanding something Black women have long articulated. People's experiences cannot always be understood by separating race from gender or one system of power from another. If we ask only how racism affects people, we may miss something. If we ask only how sexism affects women, we may also miss something. The experiences of Black women may emerge through the interactions of racism, sexism, class inequality, heterosexism, ableism, ageism, and other systems and social locations. Intersectionality, therefore, changes the questions we ask. Instead of trying to fit complex experiences into a single category, we begin asking how multiple structures of power interact to produce particular lived realities. That way of thinking is foundational to Black feminist social work. And this matters because when context is missing, we can misunderstand the very people we're trying to serve. We may misunderstand trauma if we separate an individual's experience from racism, gendered oppression, community conditions, or historical harm. We may misunderstand resilience if we celebrate someone's ability to survive without asking what survival has required of them. We may interpret reluctance to seek help as resistance without asking whether previous experiences with institutions have made trust difficult. We may also misunderstand family relationships when we apply assumptions without considering culture and history. And behaviors that appear maladaptive from one perspective may have once served an important protective function. Even our understanding of healing requires context. Who determines what wellness looks like? Who defines successful coping? Cultural responsiveness requires more than knowing that differences exist. It requires understanding the context that give experiences meaning. This distinction is one of the most important ideas I want to introduce in this series. Representation and centering are not the same thing. Representation matters. Having Black women scholars on reading lists matters. Seeing Black women represented in textbooks, classrooms, research, leadership, and curricula matters. But representation asks, are Black women present? Centering asks a deeper question, and that is, does Black women's knowledge actually change how we understand the subject? A scholar can appear on a reading list while the fundamental way a course conceptualizes knowledge remains unchanged. Centering means that Black women's scholarship helps shape the theories we teach, the research questions we ask, the interpretations we make, and the approaches we use in practice. Black feminist social work is therefore interested in more than visibility. It is interested in epistemic influence. So what happens when we center knowledge that has historically existed at the margins? Our questions begin to change. Theory can provide broader explanations of human experience. Education can expose students to expanded intellectual traditions. Research can investigate different questions and reconsider how knowledge is produced and interpreted. Practice can become more culturally and contextually responsive. Leadership can recognize forms of expertise that institutions may have historically overlooked. Policy can be informed by the knowledge of people most affected by those policies, and our relationship with communities changes. Instead of entering communities only to collect information about them, we begin recognizing communities as partners in knowledge production. Centering changes not simply who is present, it can change the work itself. This brings us to the baobab tree that I introduced in our first presentation. The roots of this tree are intentional: Black feminist thought, intersectionality, community knowledge, historical context, trauma science, liberatory traditions, and social work. These bodies of knowledge do not exist independently within Black feminist social work. They are brought into conversation with one another. The roots nourish the trunk, which represents Black feminist social work. The framework then extends outward through theory, education, research, practice, leadership, policy, and community. And ultimately, we hope that this work bears fruit through expanded knowledge, more equitable systems, holistic well-being, liberatory practice, intergenerational healing, and thriving communities. This is the intellectual space Black feminist social work seeks to occupy: deeply rooted, interdisciplinary, community-informed, and oriented toward transformation. I want to return to something I emphasized in our first presentation because I think it's important. Black feminist social work does not require us to abandon everything social work already knows. It asks us to examine that knowledge, to question it, conceptualize it, expand it, and build upon it. There is a difference between critique and rejection. Critical inquiry asks us to recognize what existing knowledge contributes and where its boundaries may be. Black feminist social work begins from the position that social work becomes stronger when the profession is willing to expand what it recognizes as knowledge. The goal is not to make our knowledge base smaller. The goal is to make it more complete. So now we can return to the question in the title of today's presentation. Why Black feminist social work? Because Black women's knowledge matters. Because lived experience can generate important insight, and because context changes how we understand human experience. Representation, while necessary, is not the same as centering, because communities are not simply recipients of professional knowledge. They are also producers of knowledge, because culturally responsive practice requires culturally responsive ways of knowing. And because if social work is genuinely committed to social justice, I believe that commitment must extend beyond whom we serve. It must also invite us to examine whose knowledge we recognize. I'd like us to return to the question that began this educational series in the first place. So in our first conversation, I asked what social work might become if Black women's knowledge, lived experiences, and leadership were recognized as essential rather than peripheral. Now that we've explored knowledge and power a little more deeply, I want to sharpen that question. If Black women's knowledge were consistently treated as foundational rather than supplemental, what might social work teach differently? What might we research differently? What might we practice differently? And then I'd like you to bring the question even closer to home. What would change in your area of social work? That is where this framework begins moving from an intellectual conversation toward praxis. As we close, I'd like to leave you with 4 questions for continued reflection. First, whose scholarship shaped your understanding of social work? Second, whose knowledge might be missing? Third, where might representation exist without true centering? And finally, fourth, what would centering require in your own work? You don't need immediate answers. Part of critical reflection is becoming willing to sit with questions long enough for them to challenge what we previously assumed. Black feminist social work doesn't ask us to know everything. It asks us to remain curious about what we may not yet know. In our next presentation, we're going to move into the intellectual roots of Black feminist social work. We'll explore some of the traditions that nourish this framework, including Black feminist thought, womanism, intersectionality, Black feminist epistemology, Black social work traditions, and liberatory traditions. If today's conversation asked whose knowledge becomes foundational, our next conversation asked where does Black feminist social work come from intellectually? And I think that's important because new frameworks do not appear out of nowhere. Black feminist social work grows from a much longer intellectual, professional, and liberatory tradition. Before we can fully understand where this framework might go, we need to understand the roots from which it grows. In our next presentation, we're going to move into the intellectual roots of Black feminist social work. We'll explore some of the traditions that nourish this framework, including Black feminist thought, womanism, intersectionality, Black feminist epistemology, Black social work traditions, and liberatory traditions. If today's conversation asks whose knowledge becomes foundational, then our next conversation asks, where does Black feminist social work come from intellectually? And I think that's important because new frameworks do not appear out of nowhere. Black feminist social work grows from a much longer intellectual, professional, and liberatory tradition. Before we can fully understand where this framework might go, we need to understand the roots from which it grows. So I want to thank you so much for joining me for this conversation on Black feminist social work. I hope today's presentation encouraged you to think not only about the knowledge social work possesses, but about the processes through which knowledge becomes recognized as foundational. These questions are not intended to diminish our profession. They're an invitation to imagine its possibilities. What knowledge have we inherited? What knowledge have we overlooked? What knowledge remains to be created? And what might our profession become when we make room for all three? Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep imagining what social work can become. So I've taken the liberty to add several of the foundational scholars and intellectual traditions informing today's discussion. Here, I encourage you not to think of these references simply as sources attached to a presentation, but as invitations to continue reading. Black feminist social work is grounded in a much larger intellectual tradition. And throughout this series, we'll spend more time engaging directly with many of these scholars and their contributions. Thank you for staying through to the end, and until next time, take great care.